At 7:51 in the morning on August 15th, 1943, First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 124 pushed his throttle to military power above Vella Lavella in the central Solomon Islands and turned his Corsair into the enemy. His division had 4 aircraft. The Japanese formation above him, Aichi dive bombers and Zero fighters descending toward Allied ships, supporting a Marine landing on the island below, outnumbered them 6-1. He turned in anyway. What happened above Vella Lavella in the minutes that followed would begin to answer a question that Japanese naval aviation had been confidently settling since the previous February. The pilots of the Imperial Navy's land-based air groups at Bougainville had faced the F4U Corsair before. They believed they understood it. They had told their commanders what they understood. They had adjusted their tactics accordingly, and those tactics had been producing results. What they had not yet fully adjusted for was the pilot now climbing toward them. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The F4U Corsair arrived at the Solomon Islands, carrying a reputation that ran in 2 contradictory directions simultaneously. Among its designers and within the American aviation establishment, it was understood to be the most powerful single-engine fighter aircraft yet produced in the United States. A machine built around an engine of extraordinary output whose performance numbers had caused genuine excitement when they came in from the first official Navy trials. Among the Japanese naval aviators who would encounter it over the Solomons in the winter and spring of 1943, it arrived as a capable but manageable threat. The problem for both sides was that these assessments were about the same aircraft. The difference between them was a matter of how the aircraft was flown, and that difference would not be resolved in a conference room or a briefing tent. It would be resolved in the air above a chain of tropical islands, where both sides were spending their pilots at a rate that neither could indefinitely sustain. The story of the Corsair begins in the summer of 1938, when the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued a contract to Chance Vought Aircraft at Stratford, Connecticut. The requirement was direct: a single-engine carrier fighter with performance exceeding anything then in production or development. The Vought design team, under Chief Engineer Rex Buren-Beisel, settled on an answer built around the most powerful radial engine then available to a single-engine airframe, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows. A rated output at takeoff power of 2,000 horsepower. No American carrier aircraft had been designed around an engine of this output. The performance projections Beisel's team produced were not modest. A maximum speed approaching 420 miles per hour at high altitude, a service ceiling above 35,000 feet, climb rates that would leave the current generation of naval fighters behind at the first throttle push. 2,000 horsepower required a propeller of corresponding size to convert that output into thrust. The 3-blade Hamilton Standard propeller selected for the production aircraft measured 13 feet and 4 inches from tip to tip. This was, at the time of the Corsair's design, the largest propeller ever fitted to a single-engine fighter intended for carrier operations. On a conventional low-wing airframe with standard main landing gear, a propeller of this diameter would either drag the runway or require landing gear of impractical height and weight. Neither was acceptable. Beisel's solution was the inverted gull wing. By bending the wing sharply downward from the fuselage attachment point and sweeping it back upward toward the tip, the Vought team could place the main landing gear at the wing's lowest point, the angle of the bend, and keep the strut short enough for practical use while still clearing the propeller arc. The result was an aircraft that bore no visual resemblance to anything else in production. The long, blunt engine, cowling angled upward above a set of wings, bent in a way that suggested, to the uninitiated eye, something between deliberate engineering and structural compromise. It was neither. It was a precise solution to a specific aerodynamic problem, arrived at by men who understood both. The prototype, designated the XF4U, one with Bureau number 1443, made its first flight on May 29, 1940, with Vought Chief Test Pilot Lyman A. Bullard Jr. at the controls at Bridgeport Municipal Airport in Connecticut. In official Navy trials conducted the following winter, the aircraft exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight. the first American single-engine fighter to achieve that figure. The Bureau of Aeronautics issued a production order. The aircraft was named the Corsair, a name Vought had carried on earlier designs. Then the Navy's evaluation pilots began carrier qualification testing, and the problems began in earnest. The cockpit in the production F4U sat far aft on the fuselage, behind the center of the wing. The engine cowling stretched more than 9 feet ahead of the pilot's seat. On final approach to a carrier deck, at the low airspeed and nose-high attitude that a carrier landing required, the cowling blocked the pilot's forward view almost completely. The only way to see the deck was to look around the side of the nose, which meant committing to a straight-in approach to a moving ship while unable to see the ship directly ahead. The main landing gear oleo shock absorbers were engineered to absorb the vertical loads of an arrested carrier landing, but their rebound characteristics were wrong for that environment. After absorbing the initial impact of touchdown, the oleos bounced the aircraft sharply back into the air before the arrestor hook could engage the wire properly. An aircraft that bounced clear the wire could run through the arresting barriers and go over the deck edge. With a fighter as heavy and powerful as the Corsair, nothing about that outcome was survivable. The starboard wing had a tendency to drop at stall speed, introducing an asymmetric roll that could flip the aircraft before a pilot on approach had time to correct. And in cooler temperatures, oil from the engine's lubrication circuit leaked forward along the upper cowling surface and deposited itself on the windscreen. A pilot already unable to see the deck ahead was, on some approaches, looking through a film of engine oil. The Bureau of Aeronautics issued its conclusion in the fall of 1942. The F4U was not cleared for carrier operations. The aircraft was extraordinary. In the form it had reached production, it was also too dangerous for the specific demands of carrier aviation. The Navy's solution was to redirect Corsair production to the Marine Corps, which operated its fighters from land-based airstrips in the Pacific, where longer runways and wider approaches made the Corsair's handling characteristics something a pilot could manage. The aircraft designed to be the Navy's next carrier fighter would go to war from coral strips scraped from jungle instead. Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 124 under Major William E. Guise received its first F4U-1S in the fall of 1942 and worked up to operational readiness through the winter. By early February of 1943, the squadron's aircraft had been transported to Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides aboard a jeep carrier, and the pilots had flown to Guadalcanal to join them. They landed at Henderson Field on February 12th. The average pilot in VMF 124 had accumulated approximately 25 hours of flight time in the Corsair before setting down on Henderson's Pierce steel planking runway. They were immediately assigned to combat. The following day, they flew their first operational mission, an escort of Navy patrol bombers toward Bougainville, 300 miles to the northwest. They made the transit without encountering Japanese fighters. It was one of the last uncomplicated outings the squadron would have. The Japanese had their own Coast Watcher network, a mirror of the Allied system, running from island to island through the Solomons. By the time VMF 124 flew the same mission again on February 14th, the Zero pilots at Kahili Airfield on the southern tip of Bougainville had been warned. They were waiting. The engagement did not go well for VMF 124. The Zero pilots at Kahili had been flying this airspace for more than a year. The American pilots were new to the theater, new to the aircraft, and flying an escort profile that required them to hold position around the bombers at medium altitude and medium airspeed, precisely the conditions under which the Zero's exceptional low-speed maneuverability was most decisive. By the time the formation disengaged and the survivors turned back toward Guadalcanal, for P-38 Lightnings had been lost, 2 P-40 Warhawks had been lost, 2 B-24 Liberators had been lost, and 2 Corsairs had been lost. The Japanese had lost fewer than 4 aircraft. The Marines who returned to Henderson that evening used a particular name for what had happened, one that carried a specific weight given the date on the calendar: the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The Japanese pilots who filed their after-action reports at Kahili that afternoon had real evidence to work from. The new American fighter was fast. They confirmed this, and explicitly. significantly faster than the P-40 or the F-4F Wildcat that American units had been flying over the Solomons through the previous year. At high altitude, the R-2800's output was clearly formidable. But the Corsair pilots had not used their speed to any systematic advantage on February 14th. The fight had been forced to medium altitude and medium airspeed. And at medium altitude and medium airspeed, in the horizontal turning fight that had formed the foundation of Japanese fighter doctrine since the Pacific War began, the A6M 3 Model 32-0 had been decisive. The Zero at Bougainville was powered by the Nakajima Sake 21 engine, rated at 1,130 horsepower. Its total combat weight was kept low by design choices that had been deliberate from the aircraft's inception. No pilot armor behind the seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks in the wings, structural weight stripped to the minimum that airworthiness would permit. The result was an aircraft that could turn inside any American fighter at the airspeeds where horizontal maneuvering was decisive. This had not been an accident of Japanese engineering. It had been the central philosophy of Japanese naval fighter design since the 1930s. Build an aircraft light enough to outturn everything it encounters, and the question of whether the pilot survives a hit becomes secondary to whether the enemy survives the fight. For 2 years over China and the Philippines and Malaya and the Pacific Islands, this philosophy had been vindicated. Japanese after-action assessments from the February 14th engagement concluded, in a measured language that operational reports used, that the Corsair was capable but beatable. Their existing doctrine forced the American aircraft into a slow-speed turning engagement at medium altitude, exploit the Zero's maneuverability below 300 miles per hour, had worked against every American fighter type they had faced, and it had worked on February 14th against the Corsair as well. The prescription going forward was to refine what had already proven effective. For the following 2 months, the long-range daylight missions toward Bougainville were suspended while American aviation and the theater worked to understand what had happened. VMF 124 flew air defense missions over the Guadalcanal area and shorter-range patrols, accumulating flight hours that no briefing room could substitute for. Walsh flew those hours with a particular kind of attention. He had joined the Marine Corps in 1933 at 16, first as a private learning to maintain the aircraft before learning to fly them. He had earned his wings in 1937. By February of 1943, he was 26 years old and had accumulated more flight time in the F4U than virtually anyone else in the theater. He was not the kind of pilot who generated stories about himself. He was the kind of pilot who studied performance data the way an engineer studied material tolerances, precisely, systematically, looking for the operating conditions under which the machine's properties changed. What Walsh understood about the Corsair, and what February 14th had made clear to anyone who survived it and was willing to draw the correct conclusion, was that the F4U was not built to outmaneuver the Zero. It was built to make the Zero's maneuverability irrelevant, to arrive in engagement with so much speed and altitude that the question of which aircraft turned more tightly at 250 miles per hour never arose. Walsh would say after the war, in accounts later documented by aviation historians, that there had been times he had tangled with a Zero at slow speed, 1 against 1, and had considered himself fortunate to survive the encounter. He had taken that lesson and made it the foundation of his entire combat methodology. Never let the fight slow to the airspeed where the Zero was king. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. Through the spring of 1943, as the Solomons campaign gradually pushed north and American forces secured new airfield sites on New Georgia and the Russell Islands, the pattern of Corsair engagements began to shift. Walsh recorded his first aerial victories on April 1st, 1943, in a combat patrol over the Russell Islands. 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single engagement. On May 13th, he shot down 2 more. That brought his total to 5 confirmed aerial victories. He was the first pilot to reach ace status in the Corsair. Japanese intelligence reporting from this period acknowledges, in terms that are careful and operational rather than alarmed, a change in the behavior of American fighter formations. The Corsairs were refusing, more often, to commit to the low-altitude turning fight. They were pressing attacks from higher altitude and greater speed, breaking away before the Zeros could reverse and follow. The tactical prescription remained the same: find a way to force them down. But the frequency with which the prescription was succeeding was not what February 14th had suggested it would be. By August of 1943, VMF 124 had been at it for 6 months. The squadron's aircraft had been maintained under conditions that would have been considered unacceptable at a stateside air station. Coral dust worked into every bearing surface, salt air attacking the aluminum, replacement parts arriving from supply chains that prioritized other theaters and other needs. The pilots had been flying the kind of hours that reduced a man to the essential problem in front of him and stripped away everything that was not immediately necessary. Walsh had lost aircraft to enemy fire and mechanical failure alike. He had survived landing accidents. He had learned, in the specific and unrepeatable way that combat teaches, what the Corsairs are 2800 engine could sustain under full military power, at what altitude the aircraft handled best, and at precisely what combination of speed and altitude and engagement with a Zero could be controlled rather than simply survived. On August 12th, 3 days before Vella Lavella, his hydraulic system was destroyed by cannon fire from a Zero during an escort mission over Choiseul Island. He brought the aircraft into Sedgy Point on New Georgia with no functioning gear or flaps, landing hot and fast on the strip, the Corsair's belly grinding across the pier steel planking until the airframe carried him into another aircraft parked on the field. He was inspected, cleared for flight, and airborne again within days. On the morning of August 15th, over Vella Lavella, he found what he had been building toward. The Japanese formation was descending toward the Allied landing force. Aichi 3 8 dive bombers in a coordinated attack profile with Zero fighters on escort. Walsh brought his 4 Corsairs in from above and behind, at the diving speed that the R-2800 produced without effort, at the altitude where the Zero Sakai engine could not generate the responsive power the maneuver fighting required. He opened fire on a dive bomber. He opened fire on another. His aircraft took hits, the Zero escort had found him, and the dive bomber's rear gunners were firing, but the Corsair's structure absorbed what the Zero's lightweight airframe would not have absorbed, and Walsh stayed in the attack. He shot down 2 Aichi dive bombers and a Zero fighter. His own aircraft was hit numerous times throughout the engagement. He landed at Munda in the early afternoon with his guns partially exhausted and his airframe showing the results of what he had flown through. His commanding officer filed the report that would eventually carry his name to the Medal of Honor citation issued in Washington months later. The citation described his repeated dives into a formation outnumbering his own division 6-1. What it could not fully describe was the 8 months of learning. VMF 124's learning, Walsh's specific learning, every Marine pilot's learning who had survived from February to August in a cockpit. They had been given 25 hours each to understand before the war began making its demands that made August 15th possible. The Japanese units at Bougainville recorded their own assessment of the engagement. The reports noted that the American fighter formation had not behaved in the manner that the doctrine of the previous 6 months had anticipated. They had not descended to the maneuvering fight. They had pressed through the escort at speed, fired, and disengaged before the Zeros could establish the turning engagement that Japanese doctrine required. The assessment written after February 14th, that the Corsair was manageable at slow speed, was technically still accurate. The operational difficulty, which was beginning to appear even in the qualified language of after-action reporting, was that the Corsair was no longer being flown at slow speed. 15 days later, on August 30th, Walsh flew north again toward Kahili. During the transit, his engine roughened. He set down at Munda, left the crippled aircraft with the ground crew, and took a replacement Corsair from the airfield pool. He took off again and flew north alone to rejoin his formation over Bougainville. What he found above Kahili, and what he did there, and what the water of the slot received from it, and what a group of Navy Seabees on a nearby island did about it, will be the last chapter of his first Solomon Islands tour. But the outcome of that day had already been shaped by everything that had come before it. Walsh would leave the theater in September of 1943 with 20 confirmed aerial victories and a damaged leg that was still healing when his replacement arrived. His replacement was not a single pilot. It was an entire squadron, assembled from orphaned aviators who had been waiting for a commander, given to a man who had been fighting in the Pacific since the first months of the war, and built around a philosophy of aerial combat that had nothing in common with the measured, methodical approach that VMF 124 had learned for February's disaster. Major Gregory Boynton was 30 years old. He had no squadron to command, no aircraft assigned to him, and a public relations sense that was going to cause his superiors considerable administrative difficulty over the 4 months to come. He was exactly what the situation required. On August 30th, 1943, the engine in Walsh's Corsair began to run rough somewhere over the slot on the northbound leg of a bomber escort mission toward Kahili. He brought the aircraft down to Munda Airfield, the forward strip on New Georgia that American engineers had cut from the jungle after driving the Japanese off the island in August. He set the cripple machine on the runway, climbed out, and walked to the operations area. There was another Corsair available. He took it. He flew north alone to rejoin his formation over Bougainville. What he found above Kahili was a large Japanese formation contesting the bomber approach and a developing engagement in which the bombers were not adequately covered. Walsh put the borrowed Corsair into the fight. He attacked the Japanese formation using the same methodology that August 15th had confirmed. High, fast, at the diving angle that denied the Zero's maneuverability any room to operate. He shot down 4 Zero fighters in the course of the engagement, flying alone against a formation that had no particular interest in making things easier for him. His aircraft, already borrowed, was eventually struck badly enough to force a decision. He put the Corsair into the water off Vella Lavella and waited. A group of Navy Seabees on the nearby coast had watched the Corsair go in. They found a boat, borrowed from wherever it was available, by the account that reached the debrief, and reached Walsh before the currents carried him off. The 4 kills he had scored over Kahili brought his total for the Solomons tour to 20 confirmed aerial victories. His commanding officer's report, filed over the following days, would eventually reach Washington as the foundation of the Medal of Honor recommendation. It was awarded in February of 1944. Walsh left the Solomons Theater in September of 1943. He had been flying from Henderson and Munda and Barracoma for 7 months. He was 26 years old and had the kind of combat experience that no amount of training time could have produced, and no system of instruction had yet figured out how to transmit to the pilots coming up behind him. He went back to the United States, to the training commands, where his specific knowledge about what the Corsair could do and how a pilot had to fly it to make it do those things could be given to the men who would carry it forward. The man who came north to the Solomons as Walsh was Gregory Boynton. Major Boynton was 30 years old, which was old for a fighter pilot in the Pacific. He had flown with the American Volunteer Group in China before the United States entered the war and had accumulated the kind of flying experience that made his actual age, by any operational measure, irrelevant. He had been lobbying for a command since returning to the Marine Corps in 1942, and in August of 1943 he received one, a squadron-designated VMF 214, assembled from orphaned replacement pilots who had arrived in the theater without a unit to join. They had no aircraft of their own, and a commander whose record included a period of grounding for conduct problems and a general reputation for being approximately ungovernable. They called themselves the Black Sheep. The name was not entirely metaphorical. Boynton took the squadron's first combat sortie on September 14, 1943, flying from their initial base at Banica in the Russell Islands before moving to the more forward strip at Munda, and then to Barracoma on Vella Lavella as the American advance continued up the Solomons chain. What he brought to the fight over the Solomons was not a refinement of VMF 124's carefully developed tactical doctrine. It was something different in character, an aggressive forward pressure on the engagement that was partly tactical and partly psychological, built on the premise that the Japanese units defending Bougainville and Rabaul needed to understand that the aircraft coming after them was not going to give them the choice of engagement terms. Boynton flew with a radio. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what he did with it. In the fall of 1943, above the target areas around Kahili and Bougainville, he would transmit on the frequencies that Japanese fighter controllers used and invite the pilots sitting on the ready line to come up and fight. The transmissions were in English. Whether the Japanese pilots on the other end understood the words precisely mattered less than the fact of the invitation itself. The acknowledgement, broadcast in the clear, that the Corsairs overhead intended to engage anything that rose to meet them and were not going to be persuaded otherwise. It was not a conventional tactic. It was not even, strictly speaking, a sanctioned one. Boynton did it because it seemed to work. In the first 2 weeks of the Black Sheep's operations, VMF 214 shot down 23 Japanese aircraft and claimed 11 additional probable victories, at the cost of 5 of their own pilots. The numbers were already telling a story that went beyond the individual engagements producing them. Japanese fighter aviation in the Solomons was not replacing its losses at a rate that sustained the quality of opposition it had been mounting since the beginning of the campaign. The pilots of the elite Kokutai units that had flown over Guadalcanal in 1942, men who had accumulated hundreds of hours of combat flying in the zero before the Solomons fighting began, were mostly gone. Dead over the Coral Sea, dead above the Slot, dead above Guadalcanal and New Georgia and Vella Lavella, and in the attrition of the sustained campaign that neither side had quite calculated it would be fighting for this long. The pilots who rose to meet the Black Sheep Corsairs over Bougainville in September and October of 1943 had fewer hours in the zero than the VMF. 124 pilots had accumulated in the Corsair before their first mission in February. The training system that Japan had built for its naval aviation, designed to produce a small number of highly capable pilots through a long and demanding selection process, could not generate replacements fast enough to keep pace with what the Solomons was consuming. It was not a symmetry that the Japanese did not recognize. After-action reports from this period, as post-war analysis of captured documents confirmed, acknowledged the degradation in the quality of opposition they were presenting. The prescription, again and again, was to find a way to preserve the remaining experienced pilots while the training pipeline caught up. The problem was that the Solomons was not an environment that permitted the preservation of experienced pilots. The campaign required fighting, and fighting required the pilots they had. In November of 1943, as VMF 214 continued its first combat tour, a Navy unit arrived at Ondonga on New Georgia that added another element to the pressure on Japanese aviation in the Solomons. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn had been forming Fighting Squadron 17, VF-17, since January of 1943 at Naval Air Station Norfolk. The squadron had been designated for USS Bunker Hill, one of the new Essex-class fleet carriers, but a combination of carrier scheduling and the theater's need for fighter aviation on the Solomons airfields had redirected them ashore. They painted a skull and crossbones on their aircraft and called themselves the Jolly Rogers. In 76 days of combat over the Solomons and against Rabaul, Blackburn's squadron would shoot down 152 Japanese aircraft. They never lost a bomber they were escorting to enemy action. The highest-scoring pilot in the squadron was Lieutenant Ira Kepford, who finished the tour with 17 confirmed aerial victories. Blackburn himself scored 11. The squadron was, by the end of their first combat tour, the highest-scoring Corsair unit in the Pacific Theater. Their operational contribution went beyond the numbers. VF-17 developed and proved the doctrine of roving high cover that allowed Corsair pilots to range above escorted formations and engage Japanese interceptors before those interceptors could reach the bombers. And they demonstrated that the F4U was structurally capable of carrying external ordnance for strike missions in a way that the existing tactical picture had not fully exploited. Both of these conclusions would inform how the Corsair was used for the remainder of the war. By late November of 1943, the air campaign above the Solomons had shifted its primary focus northward. American aviation was increasingly aimed not at the relatively exposed airfields of central Bougainville, but at Rabaul itself, the major Japanese naval and air base on the northeastern tip of New Britain that served as the logistical hub for Japanese operations throughout the region. Rabaul was as heavily defended as any target in the Pacific at this point in the war, with multiple airfields, substantial anti-aircraft artillery, and the remnants of Japanese carrier aviation that had been deployed there to reinforce the land-based units. Taking it on required sustained application of fighter and bomber forces at distances that pushed the operational limits of every aircraft involved. It was toward Rabaul that Boyington was flying when his service in the Pacific came to its abrupt and definitive end. By December of 1943, Boyington's kill score in the Corsair had reached 24. The record for the highest American ace score in any war stood at 26, held by Eddie Rickenbacker from the First World War and equaled in the Pacific by Marine Captain Joe Foss over Guadalcanal. American newspapers were following Boyington's approach to that record with the kind of attention that the home front gave to statistical milestones in wartime, and Boyington was not disinclined to assist them. On December 27th, he shot down another Japanese aircraft over Rabaul, bringing his total to 25. The newspapers ran the story the following day. He needed one more. On January 3rd, 1944, Boyington led 48 fighters, Marine Corsairs including his own Black Sheep and 16 Navy Hellcat from carrier-based units, against Rabaul in a large fighter sweep designed to draw the Japanese defenders into the air. He got what he came for. In the engagement above St. George Channel between New Britain and New Ireland, Boyington shot down 2 Japanese aircraft. His official total reached 26, tying Rickenbacker. His aircraft was then hit. By what, and by whom, has never been settled definitively, as post-war analysis of Japanese records and American after-action material produced conflicting accounts of the final moments above St. George Channel. What is certain is that Boyington parachuted from the stricken Corsair and went into the water. His wingman on that last pass, Captain George Ashman, was also shot down and killed. Boyington was pulled from the water by a Japanese submarine crew. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war in Japan, his existence unknown to American authorities for nearly a year. His Medal of Honor was awarded on the assumption that he was dead. He was liberated in August of 1945 and returned to the United States, which received him as both a hero and a genuine complication for the public affairs offices of the Marine Corps, neither of which he found particularly difficult to navigate. 5 days after Boyington went into the water, the first combat tour of VMF 214 ended. The Black Sheep, who had flown together for 84 days, were disbanded. In 84 days of combat, they had shot down 97 Japanese aircraft in the air, destroyed an additional number on the ground, and produced 9 aces. They received the Presidential Unit Citation for the tour. The men scattered to reassignments and recovery, and the next thing the war would ask of them. The air above the Solomons, by early 1944, was a different environment than it had been 12 months before. This was not immediately obvious from any single engagement or any specific date on which the balance shifted. It was visible in the aggregate of what the operational reports were showing, in the declining sortie rates from Japanese airfields at Rabaul, in the increasing proportion of engagements in which Japanese formations broke off the attack before pressing it home, in the ratio of aircraft losses that had been trending in one direction steadily through the year. The pilots of the units flying over Rabaul had, on average, substantially fewer flying hours than their American counterparts. The fuel that Japan could allocate to training its replacement pilots was being rationed in ways that the American training pipeline, which was now producing combat-ready aviators at a rate the Japanese system could not approach, was not. Japanese ground personnel in the islands had a name for the Corsair by this point that had not existed when VMF 124 arrived at Henderson Field. The name came from the sound the aircraft made at speed, a high-pitched whistling tone produced by the air flowing through the oil cooler intakes set into the leading edges of the wing roots. At the diving speeds that Walsh and Boyington and Blackburn's pilots had established as the Corsair's primary mode of attack, the sound arrived before the aircraft could be seen. Men on the ground heard it first from above and behind, and at a direction and distance they could not fix, and understood, based on what hearing that sound had taught them, what was about to happen. The Japanese called the Corsair the Whistling Death. The name was not assigned by theorists or intelligence analysts. It was assigned by people who had learned what it meant when the sky made that sound. The aircraft itself was evolving through this same period in ways that addressed every limitation that had made the Navy's initial rejection reasonable. The F4U 1A, which had been entering production and deployment through the middle of 1943, incorporated a pilot seat raised approximately 7 inches from its original position, a change that substantially improved the pilot's forward view on approach and partially addressed the visibility problem that had grounded the aircraft from carrier operations. The oleo strut characteristics were modified to reduce the landing bounce. A single-piece blown plexiglass canopy replaced the multi-framed birdcage canopy of the original F4U-1, further improving the pilot's field of vision. None of these were dramatic changes in isolation. Together, they produced an aircraft that handled more predictably across the speed range and gave its pilots the visibility they needed in the situations where visibility mattered most. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm had been demonstrating, since April of 1943, that the Corsair could be operated from carrier decks. Their solution was geometric, a curved, side-slipping approach that kept the deck in the pilot's peripheral vision throughout the descent, rather than the straight-in approach that the American system required, and that the Corsair's long nose made dangerous. British Corsairs flew from carriers of the British Pacific Fleet through the remainder of the war, operating against Japanese targets from Norway to the Indian Ocean to the final campaigns against the home islands. The United States Navy formally certified the F4U for carrier operations in late 1944, adopting a modified version of the approach technique that the Fleet Air Arm had been flying for more than a year. The aircraft that had been grounded from the job it was designed for had taken 2 years, and the efforts of 2 different navies to get back to where it was supposed to be. By late 1944 and through the campaigns of 1945, the Corsair was flying from the decks of Essex-class carriers and from island airstrips alike, in variants that had evolved considerably from the original F4U, one that VMF 124 had brought to Guadalcanal. The F4U 1D introduced hardpoints for bombs and rockets, converting the fighter into a carrier-capable strike aircraft that could carry a ton of external ordnance in addition to its 650 caliber wing guns. The F4U-4, which entered service in late 1944 and reached combat units in the final year of the war, was powered by the uprated Pratt & Whitney R-2800-18W engine, a version of the double WASP fitted with a water injection system for emergency war emergency power, producing 2,450 horsepower. 450 horsepower more than the engine that had been considered extraordinary in 1940. Its top speed exceeded 446 miles per hour. Its service ceiling approached 42,000 feet. The Zero's performance envelope had not expanded during the same period. Japan's manufacturing capacity, under sustained attack from B-29s operating from the Marianas and the Philippines and from carrier strikes that were ranging freely over the home islands, was producing aircraft in declining numbers and of declining material quality. The pilots flying those aircraft had, in the majority of cases, been given training measured in weeks rather than months. By the summer of 1945, Japanese fighter aviation over the home islands bore a different character than it had borne over the Solomons in early 1943. What remained was being husband for the anticipated invasion, preserved for the tactics of last resort rather than deployed in the conventional defensive operations that had defined the Solomons campaign. The Corsair was still flying combat when the war ended. The last American aerial victories of World War II were scored in F4US. It continued to fly combat for another decade after Japan's surrender. Over Korea, in the ground attack role that the Solomons campaign had pointed toward in VF-17, had formalized in a doctrine, striking at targets that mattered to an infantry battle in a theater where the air superiority question had already been resolved. The last Corsair rolled off the production line in 1952, 12 years after the prototype had first flown over Bridgeport, Connecticut. More than 12,500 were built in total. It was, for most of that production run, no longer the aircraft it had been in February of 1943. The shape was recognizable, but the engine, the armament, the carrier compatibility, and the tactical role had all been substantially transformed by what the war had required of it. The question the title of this story poses, what the Japanese assessment of the early Corsair actually missed, has an answer that goes beyond the aircraft itself. The Japanese evaluation of February 14th, 1943, was technically accurate. The Corsair, at medium altitude and slow airspeed, in the horizontal turning fight, was manageable. The men who wrote that conclusion had observed the evidence correctly. What the conclusion missed was not in the engineering data. It was in the institutional difference between what the American aviation establishment could sustain and what the Japanese one could not. The United States Navy and Marine Corps pilot training pipeline produced replacement pilots in numbers and at a quality standard that allowed the American units in the Solomons to absorb losses, rotate combat experienced pilots through training commands where that experience could be transmitted and returned to the theater with squadrons that were better than the ones they replaced. The Japanese system, built to produce a small elite and not designed for the replacement rate a sustained campaign demanded, produced pilots who were progressively less experienced than the ones they were replacing. Pilots who, by late 1943 and through 1944, were being given fewer total flying hours before their first combat sortie than the VMF. 124 pilots had accumulated in the Corsair before February 14th. Walsh had understood something about the aircraft in May of 1943 that February 14th's outcome had begun to teach. By the fall of 1943, Bougainville was flying with it in a way that took the same understanding and applied it at the level of the entire engagement rather than the individual pass. By late 1943, Blackburn was using it to demonstrate that the aircraft's structural strength allowed it to carry bombs that earlier thinking had not considered, and that the doctrine of high roving escort changed the geometry of bomber protection in a way that the early Corsair escort profiles had not. The aircraft that the Bureau of Aeronautics had refused to clear for carrier operations was, by the end of its Solomon Islands campaign, the aircraft that had come closest to breaking Japanese air power in the Pacific, not in a single decisive battle, but through the grinding arithmetic of a months-long attritional campaign that consumed Japanese aviation faster than Japan could produce it. The men who flew it are mostly gone now. Walsh survived the war, returned to the Pacific for a second tour in 1945 flying the F4U, and scored his 21st and final aerial victory over Okinawa on June 22, 1945, a Zero, the last enemy aircraft he would ever fire at. He retired from the Marine Corps in 1962 as a lieutenant colonel, after 29 years of service. Boynton came home from the prison camps in August of 1945 and lived in the complicated way that some men who survive wars they expected to die intend to live, publicly, loudly, with the specific damage that captivity and combat leave in places that don't show on the outside. Blackburn commanded his Jolly Rogers through the end of their campaign and went on to other posts, writing his account of VF-17's operations decades later in a memoir that documented exactly what those 76 days had cost and exactly what they had produced. The aircraft they flew is remembered as an icon. The distinctive bent wings and the massive cowling, the shape that became the visual shorthand for everything that American naval aviation achieved in the Pacific. The Corsair appears in museums and airshow schedules with a frequency that reflects how deeply its silhouette has settled into the popular understanding of the Pacific War. It is presented, usually, as it appeared in the later versions, powerful, confident, the whistling death of Japanese naval aviation's final year. This is not inaccurate. It is incomplete. The more complete version begins on February 12, 1943, when 24 aircraft that the United States Navy had refused to certify for carrier operations landed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, flown by pilots who had 25 hours each in the machine, and were sent north to Bougainville 2 days later. The Japanese pilots who waited for them there had real reasons for confidence. The Corsair they faced on February 14th was the aircraft the Navy had rejected. What Walsh and the pilots who came after him spent the following year and a half learning was how to make it into the aircraft the Japanese would eventually name for the sound it made when it was about to kill them. The lesson of the Corsair is not that superior technology wins wars. The technology was there from the beginning, and it did not win anything on February 14th. The lesson is about the difference between an aircraft's performance envelope and a pilot's knowledge of how to operate inside it, and about the institutional capacity to produce enough pilots who know enough about that difference to press it, at scale, against an enemy whose ability to do the same is running in the other direction. The Japanese assessment was correct. The Corsair was manageable at slow speed in the turning fight they preferred. What they did not know on February 14th, and what Walsh and Boynton and Blackburn and the squadrons behind them spent 1943 teaching them, was that nobody was going to let them have the slow speed. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.